Brent Sanford, Lieutenant Governor of North Dakota.
Also, the former mayor of Watford City. We like to mention that when we're talking about oil and gas activity because the lieutenant governor kind of grew up with the recent boom in Watford City, being in the heart of it, the heart of the Bakken shale play right now, of course, Watford City. And let's talk a little bit about what's going on in the oil and gas industry and the Bakken specifically. Just to get everybody up to speed here, we've had a well, you know what? Let's just take a step back if you wouldn't mind. By the way, how are you doing today, Lieutenant Governor Brent Sanford?
Oh, I'm doing pretty well, Jason. Thank you. Nice to be able to visit about something other than just COVID task force meetings. So I enjoy being able to visit about the industry. It's been a real challenge, and we're going to end up talking about COVID regardless because of the demand destruction the industry's seeing. But I'm doing pretty well
Well,
relatively.
well, good, good. I'd like to just kind of set the table a little bit here because I think that a lot of people outside of the energy industry don't really understand what happened in the oil and gas industry. Because when you take a look at the industry, Whiting laid off people last July, and it was like a third of the staff. And then you had Chesapeake and Halliburton had layoffs in October and November last year. China had the COVID shutdown last year as well. So the energy industry did get hit last year with a lot of different, variables. A lot of it was because of COVID-19 across the globe. And then you take a look at the Russia, Saudi Arabia, OPEC, that whole geopolitical shenanigans that happened there. And then, of course, we have the American COVID shutdown. So, there was kind of a 1, 2, 3, maybe even a 4 punch in there, depending on how many ways you want to splice it. So the energy industry really got hit really hard. This isn't news to anyone, but I do think some people forget about the global implications that helped put us where we're at today. What we're going to talk to the Lieutenant Governor about is kind of their task force for a restart program in the Bakken Restart Task Force. But first of all, Lieutenant Governor, just your comments on my opining about the kind of the global impact, if you will, what kind of really brought us to where we're at today in the energy industry.
Well, you're exactly right. The industry is basically the just-in-time inventory and demand of 100 and some million barrels a day is kind of where it was sitting, and it would go up and down, not that much compared to that, the slowly rising number that had gotten to over 100 million barrels a day, and United States had been able to carve off the number one slot in that global oil production. And obviously, thank you to the shale production, Permian and Eagle Ford and Bakken. And there was some constraint that was happening, as you said earlier. But until the impact really hit the United States, I don't think anyone saw this type of drop to go from 100 million plus barrels a day to in the 70 million range. And no one, I don't think, would have predicted a minus $37 WTI last month, and now there's people are gathering, wondering what it's going to look like at the end of the contract for the period for this month as well. But what that showed us is that there's a fear in the market. There's the actual demand destruction that occurred from people sheltering and not traveling as much, and the airlines being constrained like they are. We just had a report that our airline boardings were down over 10 times. It's just amazing what's happening there, and tough to run a business in those type of environments, but it's also leading to a lot less fuel consumption. And so here we are today, and the where it gets to for North Dakota is that the tax revenues represent roughly half of all taxes received, with the sales tax and severance taxes from the industry. And so we follow pretty closely that daily production and the price for our budgeting. And we're assuming we were going to be at around a $50 price and 1.4 million of barrels produced, and we had exceeded that up until recently. And at this point, we have a director's cut being released today. I don't know the numbers exactly, but we're looking at all the press releases, all the gathering of information from Justin Kringstad and Pipeline Authority is that we might be below 1 million barrels, which is pretty shocking. In the last downturn, we were at below 1 million barrels, I believe, only 1 month, but the industry responded quicker than they did last time with shutting in, and I would assume it was a different situation. We've got a lot of multi-well pads now, where even 5 years ago there was a lot more production trying to hold leases, etc. And now you're hearing some numbers like 70% of wells shut in from some operators. So we don't know what the bottom of this is going to be, but the news of the shutting in of production in the Permian and the Bakken evidently is helping our WTI get, inch back up into the high 20s, which is not where it needs to be, but it feels better than minus 37 and $10 that we saw. So here we are today trying to figure out what is going to happen in these communities. We've had the unemployment claims from COVID-related unemployment claims we'd already had unemployment in the energy sector before the restrictions were put in place from executive order. And so we had a rush of unemployment claims from the energy side of the state. And then with the executive orders for COVID, we saw more unemployment claims. We've had historic unemployment claims in North Dakota. Thankful to the federal delegation for helping us get flexibility in our CARES Act funding from the Fed so that we can use that to help on unemployment and not put that back on employers. But that doesn't really help that much in the short term. So to our topic for today, the Bakken Restart was formed to try to help specifically for the energy industry in that side of the state. And the looking at regulatory relief, there were requests to do things like basically that in our estimation would have been getting in between the contracts of producers and midstreamers, which it's not a very North Dakota way of doing business. So we didn't do some of those things that were being considered in Texas and Oklahoma, etc. What we ended up doing is looking at more of an incentive approach, more of a carrot approach, and in this case, what was approved at Emergency Commission, now going to our state budget stabilization group of legislators is in a dollar amount to put towards plugging wells. And what we're doing is actually getting the companies to work that actually do that kind of work, but also helping out those operators where these wells have become completely uneconomic in this time, and they're in danger of remaining shut in and the wells being destroyed, and then it becomes a lot larger liability for the state on the back end. So it actually helps the state on a budget line that we would not have had enough set aside to plug those wells and get them safely plugged and abandoned. And so we can get a handle on it now using some of these COVID dollars. It actually serves two purposes: to get some of those service businesses back to work, and helps the state with a liability that's going to be out there in a larger focus of liability to the state because of this COVID demand destruction on the industry.
You mentioned a couple of the tough topics that are very difficult for people to talk about: abandoned wells, taxes, shut-ins, that type of thing, which is kind of the broader picture of, when a company goes bankrupt or a company goes out of business. Because, in California, I think they have like 35,000 abandoned wells, for example, just to throw that out there. Has that been talked about in this task force in terms of if companies are no longer a company, what happens to those assets, or the taxes that if they're owed? I guess I don't understand how that structure works on that, but as long as we're talking about really difficult topics nobody wants to touch with a 10-foot pole, I might as well throw that one your way.
Well, it is talked about, and we're very proud that we know where our orphan wells are. We know where the abandoned wells are. If you go to the IOGCC, which the Governor Burgum is the chair of IOGCC, those oil and gas producing states that have been producing oil and gas since the late 1800s, early 1900s, don't know where their orphan wells are at. And so you might stumble upon an old well bore when you're putting in a new housing subdivision. We know where they are in North Dakota, luckily probably because we started production in the 50s and always had them mapped out of where the wells were at. So we're able to keep an accounting of ours, which is not the case for in Ohio, for instance. Or
I was going to say Ohio is just notorious for abandoned wells.
Yeah, so they don't even know where they all are. So it's drastically different conversations at those IOGCC meetings, depending on if you have current oil production and when your oil production started. So we're in better shape that way. But definitely in this case, it becomes a state liability and a state cleanup issue when the wells are abandoned because they're not economic, because the operator is not able to be found and they don't have a bond to take care of it, and so that becomes our liability. So we're able to find just to find flexibility in the funding that we can get out in front of some of this, identify those that we can't cover with the fund that we already had set aside, and get this back to work. Now, interestingly enough, the next phase of what we're talking about is furthering the more of a carrot approach versus a stick approach, and it's the fact that these shut-ins are happening on an economic basis, not because of us getting involved in any conversations between midstreamers and producers and forcing any regulation on people. But if there's shut-ins that are happening, it's their own reaction to the market demise and the market reduction. And so hopefully this doesn't happen very long, so where their wells are damaged. But what we want to do is be the first place they'd want to deploy their capital when they decide to go back into the market, when the prices come up to a decent point. And so we're looking at the next phase of this, of being an incentive package of what does that smart restart look like to come back to the Bakken first? And is it going to be tax relief? Is there going to be another grant program that can be put in place to help with having to bring that workover rig in, or having to it can be up to $70,000 to get a well back online. Well, if you've got an incentive package of taxes, or maybe even grants from North Dakota versus maybe none in other places, maybe they'd bring that capital here first. So we're going to try to be the first place that oil activity comes back when they want to bring production back online, not knowing when that's going to be. It's going to depend on how the world and the Americans and how we all start our consumption process again of travel and oil and gas demand. But when that day comes, hopefully we're first to where that capital is deployed.
Can I ask you a dumb question? You're an accountant, so you might know the answer to this, but you work at the state, so I guess you probably should know the answer to this, but it's not your department. So I was just kind of thinking that your background and just where you're at and just knowing you might know. But if you don't know the answer to this, you can always say pass, because the last thing I want anybody to do is to stick their foot in their mouth or speak what they don't know anything about. When you take somebody like, Whiting, which was kind of the poster child, I feel bad for Whiting. There's so many nice people there, and they're just getting beat up as the poster child because they were basically the first mid-major that came out and filed bankruptcy. And I know there's restructuring, and bankruptcy's changed over the last 20 years pretty dramatically. What happens on taxes for things like that with the state and those types of things? I'm sure it impacts the budget forecasts and things along those lines. Do you know the answer to that? Like in terms of who's on the hook and who, what gets restructured and that type of thing? Because it's again, we're talking about topics nobody wants to touch with a 10-foot pole, but I thought maybe because it's going on right now, you might have an answer to that. I'm just curious.
Yeah, I actually could go into this pretty deep, but the thing is that the state doesn't have equity investments in any of these operators. The state does not have loans per se in general to these. They might have a participation side to a loan, but generally not exposed on the credit side either. And what's happening on these Chapter 11 reorganizational bankruptcies is the debt financing, the bond financing that the companies have is being restructured, and so generally your bond holders, your banks, are going to have to take some portion of a percentage on the dollar, and then obviously the stock price suffers during that time. So the people owning that stock suffer. But as far as taxes, if the company's losing money, regardless and maybe they have less interest expense if they restructure, so you might actually have more net income paying North Dakota income tax. But the main driver of taxes for the state is the sales tax activity, mm-hmm. which fracking injects a lot of sales tax into the state when that process is going on. So the new well drilling and completion really brings in a lot of sales tax. And then once those wells are online, the gross production tax and extraction tax, we're taking 10% tax off the top line, off the revenue of the barrel of oil. So the real tax revenue comes after the sales tax comes in on the fracking, et cetera, and the completion. But then when the production goes, that's when the state really makes out. It's like we're a 10% partner with them without cost. It's 10% of revenue. And that's pretty steep even compared to other states. But companies choose to do business here because we are friendly on the regulatory side. We're very low on the tax side. And the Bakken geology is top notch. So anyway, the gross production extraction tax might have a better effect if someone's able to reorganize their debt and put more money towards actually drilling wells and putting people to work than paying interest.
Mm-hmm. The sales tax is really important for people to remember too, is that there's a lot. In fact, I don't know if you and I have talked about this, but Brent Bogar, when he was doing some consulting work, he had that study that showed 45, 50, 60, 70%, depending on which splice you want to do with it, because the sales tax and the motor vehicle taxes and things like that weren't necessarily included in that pie chart he had. So that's the end results were somewhat debatable. I usually went with 55% of the state's budget was kind of tied to oil and gas revenues and those extraction taxes that we're talking about. What's going on there? Because my guess is that, for one, it's probably lesson learned. We don't want to put that many eggs in that basket again because of just the market fluctuations, but maybe not. I don't know. I'm just kind of weeding through this a little bit, but you know what I'm talking about, right? The amount of percentage that was tied to the energy industry and those taxes
for the state budget.
Yeah.
Yes.
That study that Brent did, that was just, to me, it was like eye opening to me,
And that was why the Petroleum Council suggested it be done, and I don't know if they funded it or they encouraged it, but it was to point out that and it's not just the general fund number. It's not just the $400 million that goes into our $4.8 billion general fund by any means. Guess what? There's also what's called S.I.F, S-I-I-F, Strategic Infrastructure Investment Fund, that's general fund. That's another $700 million. So 25% of our general fund revenue is from straight from oil and gas taxes, the extraction taxes and severance taxes, right? And then another couple billion of revenues from sales tax, which a large part of that is from oil and gas. And that is before you even get into all the special funds. And so the state collects $4 billion plus of oil taxes, of which only, I just rattled off about $1 billion of it goes into the general funds. The other $3 billion of oil taxes, 30% of it goes to legacy fund, and then the rest goes into constitutionally funded or legal designated buckets of where it goes back out to oil and gas counties. It goes back out to tribal oil producing entity nations. It goes back to education and water. So when you're talking a legislative session and getting everyone in the state involved in conversation of funding, the education and the water project communities come together with oil and gas side, because a lot of the funding is coming from oil and gas for those areas too. So yes, we're very reliant on it, but that brings you to why the governor and I feel so strongly about diversifying the economy while we can, make some hay while the sun's shining on our fossil fuels and our oil and gas, in addition to our ag economy, and build that legacy fund up. Not tap that legacy fund. That legacy fund, you hear a lot of calls right now for spending the legacy fund for this downturn, but no, that would be like cashing in your pension. We have accounts like the budget stabilization and the S.I.F fund that are billions of dollars that are your savings accounts. But the legacy is our 401k or our pension, and that is our future. And we need to get further than where Alaska's at, closer to where Norway is, on having a sovereign fund where you can actually have earnings coming off of that legacy fund to pay for the general government services that we do need going forward when the day comes where those extraction tax can't and sales tax can't cover half of our governmental needs. So that is a legacy we want to leave, is to keep building that legacy fund, protecting that legacy fund, investing wisely so the earnings coming off that someday, when it gets to be more like closer to $100 billion or $70 billion, not the $7 billion that it sits at today, that we could actually be funding government needs for the state of North Dakota. Maybe not even have to have income tax. If we got it large enough, you wouldn't even have to have property tax. So that's the type of legacy we could leave. That'd be a fun place to be down the road for our kids. And it's possible with oil and gas.
Well, the other thing, too, that is important to point out right now is, I wanted to bring that up primarily, too, because I think it's important that the east side of the state remembers how much of the revenue comes from oil and gas activity. Because, sometimes in Fargo, you got to drive 5-6 hours to get to the closest oil rig. So they're pretty far removed from that daily life. So I try to make sure we mention that when we can. And the other thing I did want to bring up is kind of this ESG certification, where this is another obstacle, obviously, that's being thrown in the oil and gas world. And I did want to talk to you about that a little bit, because it has a direct impact on a lot of the state retirement accounts and other things like that. But as far as diversifying the economy, that's the direction to go, because that benefits industry. I mean, so much of every industry involves oil and gas, that the more you diversify agriculture and technology and healthcare, you need oil and gas to do that. You need the petroleum products, and the surge of natural gas that's coming, to where more and more energy sources are finding out natural gas is a foundation fuel, not a bridge fuel, and just those types of things. So it's good to see that diversification happening a little bit. I did want to ask you about the ESG certification and some of the things going on there, because, like I said, it does kind of tie to different retirement accounts and state budgets and that sort of thing. And we're seeing, Goldman Sachs and Wells Fargo Bank, and there's banks that are requiring this and being told not to fund projects. And I'm even hearing rumblings of even insurance and things like that. So talk to me a little bit about what's going on at the state level, and your professional level, when it comes to, the certain accounts being tied to oil and gas, and just how that whole relationship is working.
Well, the oil and gas industry's been affected by the ESG policies when they're trying to gather capital for drilling, that's for sure. So you've got these companies before this downturn, they all of a sudden had really low PE ratios, and they were having to use cash for their drilling plans, and you still couldn't capitalize toward the level where they used to. From the larger the organization they're approaching, they might have the ESG side might come out and say, we don't want you to invest in this side, and it's affecting the lignite coal generation utility industries right now too, with not only losing financing opportunities, but also the insurance industry starting to push back and not want to be involved in fossil fuel type development. So that's very concerning for North Dakota. I mean, is the next push going to be nobody wants to be involved in finance and insurance for agriculture, because agriculture has a large methane footprint and uses a lot of oil and gas for driving tractors, etc. I mean, where does this end? So this is a constant perception battle and battle of arguing science and economics, etc. From our state's perspective. Interestingly, it comes also into our boardrooms for state investment board and land board, when our investment advisors are talking ESG lending and in ESG policies, etc. I mean, on investing, and it becomes those elected board members, being elected officials in North Dakota, hearing this, it puts us in a difficult situation. But the premise around investing these funds is diversifying these investments as well. So it's not like I stated before, we aren't investing in only Bakken oil producer stocks and etc. They're very broad based, and so it's not as concerning as one might think. But it's an interesting topic that comes up when you have a bunch of elected officials from North Dakota and people that are citizens that have made their living in North Dakota.
Do you see this changing at all, or is this kind of the new normal in energy now?
Well, it seems like it's just a new normal in our society, and so the answer is, what I always say is, why not get out in front of them and point out the fact that this is the cleaner way of doing things, and we look at the reclamation gains and successes we've had on the lignite mining in North Dakota. You can't tell if that land that is being farmed was a former lignite mine or not, because of the success we've had in our reclamation standards and actually putting it into practice. And when some of the leading technologies for carbon capture coming from the EERC up at UND, from the state, from giving Lignite Research Council grants, and from giving oil and gas grants and value-added ag grants for ethanol, for CCUS, carbon capture, utilization, storage, and ethanol plants. And that cutting-edge research is happening here in North Dakota. And when I love to speak at UND, NDSU, speaking to student groups and saying, hey, why not clean it up? Why not have a negative carbon footprint here? And they say, well, you mean not a neutral carbon footprint? No, negative. What if we're hungry and using someone else's CO2? actually need someone else's CO2 to do enhanced oil recovery in our oil fields while we're taking care of our own CO2 footprint from our ethanol plants, from our coal, from our lignite industry. That's a vision that we can push towards, and having that innovation coming out of North Dakota. Then the ESG lending and borrowing and investing and insurance type policy would most likely look somewhere else. Maybe they'd look to where the actual pollution is occurring in the cities, where the EPA scores for air quality are terrible in San Francisco, and we're the best out here where we produce the power from lignite and where we produce the oil. So maybe some of those ironic situations could be focused on again.
Brent Sanford, Lieutenant Governor of North Dakota, joining us from Watford City out there in the heart of the Bakken boom. Just wrapping up here, we're talking about the Bakken Restart Task Force. We'll have the links at the Crude Life. You can check out the Sanford interview, and we'll have the links there as well. Another link we'll have there is the director's cut, which is going to be happening in it looks like about an hour or two. You mentioned Justin Kringsted's name, and so I did want to get a pipeline report, not a detailed one like Kringsted would give, and we'll have the links for his on there. But so much of natural gas and the natural gas petrochemical plants and just that next phase, if you will, have to do with pipelines. We got to get them built, that sort of thing. Do you have an update on that, just in terms of, are we out there, are we planning on, moving ahead on it? It is considered critical infrastructure by the federal government. And so my understanding is that, legally the pipeline should be moving ahead, but in today's day and age, I have no idea what to expect. So what kind of conversations are you guys having about these pipelines being built?
Like about which ones? The one like through Wyoming and South Dakota? Are you talking about in North Dakota?
My guess is we'll take any of them at this point.
Well, there's ongoing conversations about midstream development in North Dakota, obviously. I mean, and there was pretty heavy conversations about oil pipeline moving west, and the projects going through South Dakota and Montana. I mean, it just seems like there's never-ending challenges there. But the DAPL went through the PSC, increased their volumes, and now there's another legal challenge there. But the DAPL has been amazing for getting oil prices to be competitive right here in North Dakota, in the middle of the country. And it's so much safer than hauling all the oil out by rail than we were doing earlier on in the Bakken. So much safer than hauling it around by truck. And so the pipeline build out is super important to the state. The thing that we've been so focused on is the gas side of it, and been waiting for a glimmer of good hope, signs of good hope throughout the last 2 months, and one of them was the Outrigger announcement that they're moving forward. They're permitted. They're moving dirt west of Williston. That project will take not only it'll take gas from numerous producers, not just the main project sponsor, but gathering natural gas in that north of the area, north of the Missouri River area in Williams County, and much needed. They're looking at actually being able to do fractionation. We ended up short of propane this winter, so I mean, it seems nonsensical to be trying to bring propane back from Kansas after the natural gas leaves from here and goes to Kansas. So those are welcome words for us to hear. It's a huge project. Potentially maybe even start some conversations about ethane extraction and using that for power generation in the western part of the state. So I mean, there's great things still happening. So yes, the gas pipeline projects are still moving, thankfully. We hope, if there's one glimmer of positive news, that we actually aren't going to have to worry as much about our flaring guidelines, because the capture will become more important and the speed of production of the new, bringing the new wells into production is a little slower, so you can actually catch up a bit. So hopefully our gas capture becomes better in this downtime, and have us set up well going into the future. Some of the projects that were announced in December, January now are on hold, but those are expansion projects that the plans are there, the intent was there, and I would say be just like what happened with the Demicks Lake plant of One Oak, that they come online maybe 3 or 4 years later after a downturn. It's not that they go away forever. So there's a lot of good corporate partners here public-private side is seems like it's matching up well on the capture side, on the natural gas piping side, and hopefully on the value add side with these conversations about utilizing the ethane that we have here.
So just kind of wrapping up here, getting back to the beginning of the Bakken Restart Task Force. What's kind of the summation of that? What's the next step? What should people know?
We are trying to focus some of the federal resources and state resources to the Bakken, understanding the importance of the oil and gas to the entire state, and trying to bring people some hope and put people back to work in the meantime, and help with negative state budget items that we wouldn't have to fund later on if we can help some of those items now, but also looking to what that incentive might look like to bring the business back and get the jobs back here first, and get the tax revenues rolling again into our state coffers, where the education side and the water side and the general fund side really need that activity and that business activity to pick up again. And the communities out west, they're going to have to be patient again. It's going to be a 2015 and 16 repeat of finding revenues for those communities and those local governments out west, and have to weather the storm, be ready for it to come back.